Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, it is April 19th, 2025. It is the 250th anniversary of the beginning of what we often refer to as the American Revolution. The War for Independence would be a more accurate way to describe it. The first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord right outside of Boston. And so it's most appropriate then that we take a look at the story of how that all went down. Now, this video from Kings and Generals actually is called The Battle of Bunker Hill, 1775, but it covers the beginning of the American Revolution and culminates with the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is kind of the first big pitched battle of the Revolution. It happened a few months after the start of the war. So we're going to take a look at all that. I'll put the link down in the description. I know that Epic History has a video coming out today about those events, and we'll look at that sometime down the road, but obviously I'm not going to do a reaction to it on the day that it comes out. Definitely encourage you to check out Kings and Generals. They got a lot of great stuff. Let's dive into this one.
On April 14, 1775, British General Thomas Gage received orders to quash the rebellion, disband the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and arrest resistance leaders, notably Samuel Adams and John Hancock. This dismayed Gage, for he knew that any attempt to arrest colonial leadership or disband their assemblies would trigger riots, if not open rebellion.
Yeah, this is a great point. Thomas Gage is a pretty pro-American guy. He's got a lot of sympathy for the people of British America, and at this point the Massachusetts colony is basically under martial law. They've stationed a bunch of troops there. Tensions are rising all the time. This is very much contained to New England. Yes, there is discontent throughout the colonies, but it's most egregious here in Boston, and so everybody knew that if it was going to happen, it was going to happen here.
Unwilling to simply refuse orders, Gage instead elected to use his granted discretion to modify the mission. Rather than a campaign to root out the rebellion, for which there weren't enough soldiers in all the Americas, he would instead disarm the militia via a swift raid. He hoped removing their ability to fight would sap their will to revolt. And
isn't it interesting that his goal was to do something that wouldn't be as inflammatory, that wouldn't cause the problems that otherwise following his orders to the letter of the law would have done, and yet it's these actions that sparked the revolution.
Put an end to Massachusetts's defiance. He was wrong. Welcome to our second video on the American Revolution, where the British and Continental armies will clash at the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Which didn't happen on Bunker Hill.
This video was sponsored by our kind YouTube members and patrons. Becoming a YouTube member or patron is the best way to support our work, so we're now providing our supporters with exclusive videos to thank them. Join their ranks to watch the Pacific War series, alongside the First Punic War, Sulla's biography, the Italian War of Unification, Risorgimento, the Russo-Japanese War, Albigensian Crusade, History of Prussia, and much more.
Yeah, I'm a patron. They've got some great stuff on there.
Also exclusive videos in total. In 2024, YouTube members and patrons will watch series on the Fall of Sparta, the Reconquista, Second Punic War, Spanish War of Succession, and Russian Civil War, and will continue getting early access to all videos, access to an exclusive Discord server, will know our schedule, and vote on future videos. YouTube member and patron support allows us to keep the majority of our videos free in a world where YouTube monetization income is very uneven. If you want to support our work, join their ranks today via the link in the description and pinned comment. Thank you. On the evening of April 18th, General Gage gathered his officers and informed them of the operation.
Now, check out this map of Boston, because if you look at Boston today, it doesn't look like this. See how Boston's all on this little peninsula that's connected by this narrow strip of land? Most of this now is all land, because Boston is reclaimed land. It's artificial, it's man-made. They've filled in a lot of this, including where the airport is built, is on man-made land.
700 infantry, consisting of a vanguard of elite light infantry and the main body of grenadiers, would cross the Mystic River by boat, then march 17 miles to Concord, destroy all military supplies, and return. Mounted patrols had already been dispatched to scout the area and set roadblocks. Unfortunately for Gage, the Sons of Liberty discovered his intentions almost immediately, and Dr. Joseph Warren dispatched Paul Revere and William Dawes to spread the alarm.
And Joseph Warren, remember that name, because when we get to the Battle of Bunker Hill, he's going to be one of the prominent leaders of the Continental forces there. It's Paul Revere, William Dawes, eventually going to be joined by a guy named Dr. Samuel Prescott. Everybody talks about Paul Revere, and I think a lot of that comes from the poem, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man was still alive," and on it goes. When I was in 8th grade, we had to take a prominent American poem and turn it into a song. And my group did the midnight ride of Paul Revere, and we turned it into a hip-hop song. So that's why I remember a good bit of it. But it wasn't just Paul Revere. In fact, Paul Revere does the least of these three guys because he gets captured. But there's a line in the poem about one if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm. So they placed the lanterns in the Old North Church as a warning to let them know which way they're coming, and they're coming by sea, which means they're coming this way as opposed to land, which means they would have been going this way here.
Dawes went south via the Boston Neck, while Revere rode north across the Mystic. The two men met up just outside Cambridge and continued to Lexington to warn both the local militia and Adams and Hancock,
and there were other people besides just those three, too. There were a number of riders. There was a whole system in place by the Sons of Liberty and others to be able to quickly get the word out. They had been laying the groundwork for all of this for quite a while.
Hiding in the village. Messengers were then sent out to alert neighbouring towns to turn out their militia. After the message was delivered, Dawes and Revere continued on to Concord, joined by resident Dr. Samuel Prescott. Unfortunately, the men ran into a British roadblock. Revere was captured, but Dawes and Prescott fled into the woods. Dawes fell from his horse, but Prescott successfully made it to Concord around 3 a.m.
And this is what's important, because the big store of ammunition they're after is in Concord.
Now, militia companies all over Massachusetts were marshalling toward Concord. By the time the British regulars completed their crossing and began their march at 2 a.m. on the 19th, their mission was effectively a failure.
Yeah, so, and I did a video. This was actually before Vlogging Through History existed. It was back when I just had the gaming channel, but I was in Lexington and Concord back in 2020. It was actually the week that COVID shut everything down. In fact, the day I flew home from Boston was the day that my kid's school was shut down for the year. But I made a video about it and re-uploaded it to Vlogging Through History 4 years ago with my early intro that I had. And I covered some of these events, and I'll put a link up on the screen at the end as well as down in the description. But the militia gathers at Lexington initially at like 1, 2 a.m. when they first get the word. I mean, that's how quickly word got out. Just as the British regulars are leaving Boston, word's already spread to these places. And so they come out with loaded weapons. Well, when nothing happens, they disperse, but they've got loaded weapons. And so they're all firing their weapons to kind of discharge them. And Paul Revere, who has been captured and is being held over closer to Concord, hears this as well as his captors, and they think that a battle has broken out. Well, it's just the guys discharging their weapons.
All usable stores were removed from Concord within a few hours of Prescott's arrival, and only a few bags of old musket balls and 3 24-pounder siege cannons, too heavy to move on broken gun mounts, remained. The vanguard arrived in Lexington around 5 a.m. to find 80 militia assembled on the village green, but not blocking the road. Instead of marching past, the soldiers...
Yeah, so there's roads on either side of the village green, so the British regulars could have easily just gone around them. And I should point out why I'm saying British regulars, because Paul Revere and the others didn't ride through town saying the British are coming, the British are coming. Why? Because they were all British. It didn't make any sense to say that. The most common likely thing they were saying was the regulars are out, or the regulars are coming out.
Moved onto the green in front of the militia to prevent a flank attack. The two sides simply stared at each other while a British officer started ordering the militia to disperse. Then a shot rang out.
So supposedly the captain in charge of the American militia, there's like 77 of them, years later an eyewitness and that captain's grandson will say, his name was Parker, will say that what he said was something to the effect of, Stand your ground and don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. It's not probably quite that eloquent what he actually said, but that's how it got. It's one of those quotes that years later got embellished a little bit. But he said something to the effect of basically, don't do anything to start a fight. And in fact, he actually gives an order for them to withdraw before the shot is fired.
No one knows who fired the shot heard around the world.
That is not... everybody does this. That is not the shot heard around the world. And I can tell you that because when you go there, they will tell you. The shot heard around the world, as it's referred to, is at Concord. Later on, it's the first time that Americans are actually ordered to fire on British regulars. It's the volley that is fired at the bridge at Concord. That is the shot heard around the world.
But the British regulars responded to it by firing a volley and charging the Continental line. By the time Major Pitcairn regained control of his soldiers, 8 militiamen lay dead on the green.
And those 8 men are now buried at Lexington Green, even though they weren't originally buried there.
With little other choice, the British column continued on to Concord, as news of Lexington spread. Knowing they were outnumbered, the 250 militiamen already in Concord retreated across the North Bridge to await more reinforcements, allowing the British to search the empty town. After destroying the cannons' mounting points, the regulars threw the musket balls into a pond and burned the gun carriages. As the smoke from the fire rose, the militia moved back towards the bridge, now numbering 400. The British Light Company holding the bridge retreated across and formed defensive positions, and another standoff ensued. Then a shot was fired from the British side. Again, this set off the regulars, who fired off a volley without orders, but unlike at Lexington, this time the militia returned fire.
That's the shot heard around the world.
The regulars' leadership, leading from the front, quickly went down, and the leaderless and exhausted soldiers fled back towards an oncoming relief column.
So remember, at this point, these British soldiers, most of them are probably young guys who have never fought before. Some of the officers probably fought in the 7 Years' War. They have some combat experience, but most of these guys on either side have never fired a shot in anger at another human being before. They've already been going for 12 hours at this point. They set off just after midnight. They're 18 miles from their base in Boston. They are now facing a hostile, not only militia in front of them, but gathering thousands of American Minutemen and militia. They're converging on this location. And now these British soldiers have to hoof it back 18 miles, exhausted, under constant fire.
The militia then pulled back and allowed the relief force to recover their wounded. By 11:30, the search was complete, and the order to return to Boston was given. However, the countryside was now swarming with nearly 2,000 outraged militiamen.
Yep.
As the British column marched back, militiamen ambushed them from every bush, fence, wall, and tree.
Could you just imagine what it would be like to be like an 18 or 19-year-old kid in this British column, just being fired on? I mean, you got to march 18 miles wondering if the next rock that you see up on the hill is going to have militiamen under it or behind it that are going to fire on you,
ultimately causing around 300 casualties. By the afternoon of the 19th, the British met with reinforcements and escaped into Boston, while still growing militia forces made camp outside.
So, one of the smart things that happens here is that Gage sends a relief column. He sends another brigade out to meet them when word gets back of what's happening. By that point, the column that had gone to Concord had made their way back to Lexington, and there's actually some serious consideration to surrendering because of their situation, because they're exhausted, they're surrounded. But then that relief brigade arrives and allows them to be able to get safely back to Boston.
Boston was now under siege by rebel forces, as the militia force swelled to 4,000.
4,000, just like that.
With Gage's worst fears having become a reality, the mild general characteristically tried to defuse the situation by appeasing both sides, playing at being both Britain's general and Massachusetts' civilian governor. On the civil side, Gage refused to impose martial law or take any action against opposition newspapers and leaders, instead crafting a deal with city aldermen to surrender any remaining personal weapons in exchange for safe passage out of Boston. On the military side, Gage immediately began building fortifications on the Boston Neck, and sent reinforcements to Charlestown to fortify the heights, which would ultimately be abandoned after Gage decided to tighten his lines. Next, he sent orders to the remaining garrisons in Canada to send surplus troops to reinforce him in Boston, then dispatched requests to London for reinforcements.
Which, I mean, you're talking about a 4-month round trip to go to and from Boston with all this information and need.
Unbeknownst to Gage, the request was superfluous. A British force of 4,500, led by Major Generals William Howe, John Burgoyne and George Clinton, had been dispatched to Boston along with a Royal Navy squadron in March.
And Howe and then later Clinton are going to be your later British overall commanders in North America.
London had intended to send the force alongside delivering Gage his initial orders to crush the rebellion, but it had been delayed, first by difficulties putting the troops together, and then finding officers to lead them. Howe was ill-fit for command, but he was the most senior general willing to do so.
And his brother was in command of the fleet.
Every general above him was either too old to go to America or too opposed to Prime Minister Lord North's policies.
Yeah, that's a good reminder there that not all British soldiers were gung-ho about fighting in the colonies. A lot of people, even in the government, weren't necessarily that way, but Frederick North, who is probably a half-brother to the king, or could have been. In fact, that's why he's called Frederick. He'd be an uncle to the king, King George. Well, no, maybe he is a half-brother. I'd have to look it up. But Frederick was actually King George III's father's name, and there was rumors that he was an illegitimate son of the king.
Like others among British military brass, Howe was no fan of the Prime Minister. However, his sense of duty trumped personal attachment, and when asked by King George III, he accepted the command. By the morning of April 20th, approximately 16,000 members of the Massachusetts militia, now commanded by Massachusetts' Commander-in-Chief, Major General Artemus Ward, were loosely assembled in the hills surrounding Boston.
Think about that, 16,000 showed up. Imagine if you're the British facing that. You go out to try and destroy some rebellious stores of ammunition and weapons. Next thing you know, you're besieged by 16,000 men who just came out from their homes.
As news of the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord spread, more began marching towards Boston from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, who would ultimately also fall under Ward's command. British warships in Boston Harbor made a direct attack on the city impossible, so Ward prepared to besiege the city while asking around for cannons and his objective. He, like everyone else, was mainly concerned with what now?
Yeah. Everybody
that
showed
answer
up. What do
would
we
come
do?
from all over. The Provincial Congress was willing to fight, but knew it couldn't alone. To preempt Gage's official report, it gathered sworn testimony on the events of Lexington and Concord from eyewitnesses, militiamen, and British prisoners. These descriptions of the battle were sent both to the other colonies and to London via a fast ship.
Yeah, so this is important. I saw somebody on social media earlier today say something about how the American War for Independence is like the first propaganda war. I don't know if that's true, that it's the first time, because propaganda has always been a part of a war, but it was a huge part of what the colonists were trying to do, and they had been experts at propaganda for a while at this point. And they understand that right now this is just New England. These are New England militia that have come out, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Boston, your Massachusetts, Rhode Island. You're not getting Virginians and North Carolinians and Georgians right now. And so you need them on your side. You need a united front. And so you've got to convince these folks to be a part of that. And one of the people who knew that better than anyone was John Adams in the Second Continental Congress. And we'll see, I'm sure, what he does to deal with this.
It engages report by 2 weeks. Given by sympathetic officials to London's papers, the reports garnered more sympathy and support for the colonial cause. Gage's clinical and vague report, in comparison, would not engender much endearment towards the British government.
He's a military guy. He's not first and foremost thinking about how to sell this to the public.
The propaganda effort was most effective in the colonies themselves. Prior to Lexington, public opinion was relatively evenly divided between the anti-Parliament patriots and pro-Parliament loyalists.
And it's important, you see, especially in the South, especially in the Carolinas, and this is why, particularly in the Carolinas, this is going to become a real civil war, because you have a lot of loyalists among the American colonists there. And I've got Downstairs on my shelf with a lot of my memorabilia, I've got a piece of what was called the Tory oak, which was the tree that my 5th great-grandfather, who was a loyalist, a Tory militia captain, was hanged on in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, because he fought for the wrong side.
The bloodshed on Lexington Green caused many moderate loyalists to change sides. In turn, legislatures began stripping royal governors of their powers, or outright expelling them.
One of those royal governors is Franklin in New Jersey, who's the son of Benjamin Franklin.
However, the question of what to do was too vexing for any one colony to answer. Thus, the Continental Congress was reconvened earlier than planned. Word was sent out in late April to meet in Philadelphia, but it would take time to gather the delegates. Independently, a long escalating conflict between Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, and the Legislative House of Burgesses had boiled over. After years of mutual antagonism, on April 20th, Dunmore handed over the Williamsburg magazine to Royal Marines from HMS Magdalen. Militia, particularly the Hanover militia led by Patrick Henry, responded by first trying to stop the handover and then marching on Williamsburg. Dunmore would flee, first to his hunting lodge, and then be driven from Virginia to the safety of the Royal Navy. Meanwhile, a young captain in the Connecticut militia named Benedict Arnold, having received word to march for Boston, wrote to the Connecticut Committee of Correspondence that as of his visit the year before, Fort Ticonderoga was undermanned with...
Benedict Arnold is one of the heroes of the Revolution in the first few years. That is why his betrayal later in the war stung so badly, especially to people like George Washington, because people knew his quality. People knew how important he had been. And Ticonderoga, this is going to be one of the early turning points, is taking that fort and taking those guns. It's what's going to put an end to the siege of Boston.
Plentiful stores of gunpowder and cannons. The committee immediately dispatched recruiters north to take the fort, raising militia on the road. Unaware of these developments, Arnold arrived outside Boston and told their Committee of Safety the same thing. On May 3rd, Massachusetts commissioned him a colonel, assigned him recruiters and funds, and gave him orders to recruit militia and take the fort. Arriving in Castleton on the border between Massachusetts and the New Hampshire grants, Arnold learned that some of the Connecticut recruits and the Green Mountain Boys, local militia led by Ethan Allen, were already preparing to take Ticonderoga.
It's so cool. I mean, this is why you see right now why the Continental Congress is going to decide to choose an overall commander-in-chief of all colonial forces, because you've got all of these separate militias popping up, and you're going to have competing missions and competing commanders. And this happens. You've got Ethan Allen going with the Green Mountain Boys. You've got Benedict Arnold going with his own commission. Who's in charge and who has the right to do it and who makes the decisions?
Determined to take the fort himself, Arnold raced ahead to meet with Allen, using his official commission to claim leadership of the expedition. While the only authority Ethan Allen recognized was his own, he at least paid lip service to Arnold's claim, mostly because time was of the essence. Scouting reports on May 7th had shown how unprepared Ticonderoga was to withstand a continental siege, but British reinforcements were expected to shore up the fort's defenses soon.
You notice how you've got waterways in all these key areas. The British Royal Navy, of course, is always a force to be reckoned with, and this is why they're able to keep their men supplied and armed and withdrawn when necessary.
The time to attack was now, without Arnold's recruits. At 11:30 p.m. on May 9th, Allen's 160 men moved into position across Lake Champlain from Ticonderoga, with the intention to attack at midnight. However, the boats didn't arrive until 1:30 a.m., and there weren't enough for all the men. Fearful of losing the element of surprise, Allen and Arnold ordered the attack with the men already ashore. The only sentry on duty ran away, and the fort was taken. Over the next few weeks, up to 400 militiamen would arrive to garrison the fort, although Arnold's control over them was tenuous at best. That same day, the Second Continental Congress convened, its powers and objectives unclear. The congressional delegates had been authorized by their home legislatures to discuss and plan a coordinated response to British actions. But what that meant and how much authority Congress had was entirely undefined,
Right. I mean, this is all new. Nobody knows. And, obviously the representatives from places like Boston, which you've got John Hancock and, John and Sam Adams, they're going to be much more forceful in wanting a strong military response and wanting to support these militias fully. But places like Virginia, North Carolina, these bigger states that don't really have skin in the game yet, they're a little more hesitant.
And left for the delegates to figure out. Deciding on their course of action and what resources were available would be their second order of business. The first was to gather more allies. Only 12 colonies had attended the first Congress, and the second hoped it could induce more to join the cause. Letters were immediately sent to Georgia and the Canadian and Caribbean colonies, inviting them to endorse and join the Congress.
That's a great point. I mean, we think so often about the 13 colonies, but they were just among many British colonies. And so we could be talking about the 14 British colonies, or the 12, or the 10, or the 15, depending on who would have responded to all of this.
Any response would take time to receive, so Congress busied itself figuring out what it was actually doing. After a month of debate, Congress finally agreed that war was upon them and that it would have to fight. To do this required an army, and fortunately there was already one in existence around Boston. Thus, on June 14th, Congress decreed the formation of the Army of the United Colonies, consisting of the militia units in the Boston area.
So basically they're adopting the militia already in the field as a Continental Army, but now you need a commander.
Next day, acting on John Adams's recommendation, Virginia delegate George Washington was selected to serve as its general. And
a couple things about George Washington being selected as commander-in-chief here. First of all, everybody makes a big deal about how Washington was reluctant to do it, and he was like, I don't know if I'm up to the task, but I'll do my best. My man showed up in uniform to the Continental Congress. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was a humble guy, but he also wanted the job. He wanted the job badly, and he just needed somebody to give it to him. Secondly, John Adams' brilliant move, making a Virginian the commander. This gives Virginia skin in the game. This puts them in... This unites the colonies. You've got New England militia led by a Virginian with military experience.
Commander-in-Chief, with Dr. Warren made his second in command. Washington had little idea what situation he'd just signed up for.
And you had to put a Boston guy in there as second in command, right? And Warren, Washington is not there yet, so Warren's the commanding general on the ground.
And no one knew that the newly formed army's first test would arrive before it was technically formed. Generals Gage and Ward had spent the rest of April and May staring at each other while trying to find supplies for their soldiers. Ward had particular difficulties, as the New England militia he commanded had marched out with few provisions, expecting a quick confrontation before returning home. Having not bargained on a siege, many lacked even basic necessities.
And this will be a problem throughout the war. If you look at pension records, if you go to fold3.com and you get a membership, you can access all of the American Revolution pension records for guys who applied for pensions after the war. And when they ask them about their service record, most of these guys who served in the militia will say in 1777, I served 4 months in so-and-so's company. And then I served in 1778 for 3 months in so-and-so's company. In 1779, I did 6 months in another company. They came, they served for a couple months, they went home, tended to their crops, tended to their families, and then they went back out again. The Continental soldiers are the ones who are there consistently. They're enlisted. But these militia were not in this thing for 7-8 years straight.
Thus, many companies simply went home to restock. Throughout May, companies trickled in and out of the camps without notice. Discipline and chain of command beyond the individual militia company was virtually non-existent. Even if Ward had the supplies and strategic opportunity for an operation against Gage, he didn't know what troops were available or if they'd follow orders.
Right, and they don't have the training, they don't have the discipline to go toe-to-toe against thousands of British regulars.
Similarly, Gage was hampered by a lack of troops and supplies. The Royal Navy's presence ensured that no attack across the harbour or Boston Neck would succeed, but he was so heavily outnumbered and low on gunpowder that he couldn't risk leaving Boston. He'd even given orders to abandon partially complete fortifications in Charleston and other outlying outposts to keep his lines as tight as possible. His supply line via the ocean was open, but the nearest guaranteed source was the garrison in Halifax, Nova Scotia. That said,
and Halifax will be kind of a jumping off point later on in 1776 for the massive British fleet that's going to be carrying 30,000 troops to New York City.
Gage's supply problem would be alleviated first, thereby giving him the strategic initiative. Howe's reinforcements, supplies, and additional warships trickled in over the course of May. Howe, Burgoyne, and Clinton didn't arrive until May 25th. With the effective force now up to 6,000, Gage began planning to break out of Boston. By June 12th, he and the generals had agreed on a plan.
And look at this. What are you thinking? Okay, you've got a fleet available to you. You don't want to go across the neck here and charge into Continental fortifications at that spot. It's such a bottleneck and such a nightmare. What's your best option if you're going to try to stay in the area? Well, you're going to use your fleet and you're going to land somewhere else.
They would seize the Dorchester Neck, then fortify the heights to use as a staging ground to sweep the militia from Roxbury.
And that was important because Dorchester Heights right here, as you're going to find out later on, are one of the keys to all of this because they're high ground and they overlook the city of Boston. You've got to secure that.
Once that was accomplished, a second attack would retake Charlestown. Then a pincer attack would drive the rebels from Cambridge.
It's not a bad plan.
The attack was scheduled to begin on June 18th. However, Gage's plans were once again immediately leaked. On June 13th,
This is an ongoing theme. In addition to the propaganda abilities that the American colonists have, the spy network even then is incredible. And of course, Washington's going to formalize it with the Culper Ring.
This Committee of Safety warned Massachusetts of Gage's intentions. Realizing the danger, Ward directed his second-in-command, General Israel Putnam, to fortify the heights above Charlestown. On the night of June 16th, Colonel William Prescott led 1,200 militia across the Charlestown Neck to begin expanding and improving the abandoned British fortifications on Bunker Hill. However,
Notice where Bunker Hill is. Bunker Hill is way back here. That's not where this battle's fought. It's fought at Breed's Hill.
It became apparent that Breed's Hill was the better artillery position, so he began constructing the primary redoubt there. The British quickly noticed the work, but General Clinton failed to convince the other generals to prepare an attack at dawn. The only response came from HMS Lively at 4 a.m. However, Admiral Samuel Graves, irritated that unauthorized fire had woken him from his sleep, ordered it to stop.
Stop firing, I'm trying to sleep.
Once the sun rose, Gage finally realized the situation he was in. He ordered a bombardment of Breed's Hill by all the warships and a battery in Boston. The bombardment was completely ineffective, as the fortifications were too high up the hill for the warships, and too far for the Boston batteries to reliably hit. A ground assault would be needed. Meanwhile, Prescott had realized that Breed's Hill could be easily flanked. Short of troops, he ordered breastworks built on the hill's more vulnerable east side, hoping the steepness of the west side was enough protection. Sharpshooters were stationed in Charlestown to scout and oppose any landing. A dawn attack was now impossible, so General Clinton advocated for the Navy to sweep the militia from Charlestown Neck before landing troops to seize and fortify it, thus trapping and starving out the defenders on the hills.
And that's really what they should have done. I mean, this is smart. Don't launch an all-out frontal assault on a fortified high ground position. You can't soften it with your artillery. Just starve them out. Cut them off.
This idea was disregarded by the other generals for breaking conventional wisdom and placing their forces between two armies. Howard Burgoyne further believed that the militia would never stand against real soldiers.
And this is part of the problem, is that you have conventional warfare going up against unconventional warfare. And so the British, what they've always done, they can't do against this opponent. They could have had their Navy over there, and if they had been threatened from the other side, they could have used the Navy to protect their soft underbelly, so to speak, while they had this cut off. Meanwhile, you have other generals who just don't have any regard for the American militia and think that they're going to be a pushover and easy to knock off that hill.
Burgoyne boasting that the untrained rabble would simply rout when presented with trained troops. Instead, Howe would lead 1,500 grenadiers and light infantry to land near Moulton's Hill, then sweep around the redoubt's left flank and attack from the rear, while a diversionary attack of 1,000 would land at Charlestown and feint a direct assault on the redoubt. Major Pitcairn would command a reserve force of Royal Marines.
And this is Major Pitcairn, who was at Lexington and Concord.
This force wasn't assembled to cross the Charles until midday. By 2 p.m., Howe's assault force was across and ready, but he held back from attacking to request reinforcements and allow his troops to eat. Seeing the British preparations, Colonel Prescott called for reinforcements. Howe's delay allowed them to arrive. Several companies of Connecticut and later New Hampshire militia responded and were positioned behind a dirt and rail wall on the Mystic side. When low tide opened a gap, the wall was extended down the beach. Scattered groups of militia would continue to arrive prior to and during the battle. Among them was Dr. Warren, who'd refused to serve as an officer and insisted on being in the front line of infantry. Confusion reigned, as Prescott and Putnam had difficulty getting the various militia companies to follow orders.
Remember, this is Dr. Warren, who's now second in command of the Continental Army, and he's the overall commanding general on the ground here, though he doesn't even recognize his own authority in that regard.
The battle started at 3 p.m. once Howe received his reinforcements. The main column had been under fire from sharpshooters for some time before naval cannon fire set the town on fire, with the resulting pillars of smoke partially obscuring the hill. Howe's troops moved forward toward the wall, while his light infantry moved onto the beach, and his grenadiers advanced through the fields.
So this fire doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is, because it's obscuring the ability for some of these warships to see the American lines and therefore offer fire support for the advancing troops.
Unseen obstacles in the unmowed fields slowed the grenadiers' advance, leading the light column to make first contact. The militia volley fired at 50 paces, utterly shattering the surprised light companies, which fled the field with heavy casualties. The grenadiers fired a volley at the wall before charging with bayonets, only to suffer the same fate. The diversion column moved into musket range to suppress the redoubt, but suffered like the grenadiers, compelling Brigadier Piggott to order a retreat. Howe reformed his troops, called in the reserves, and attacked again, this time at the breastwork rather than the wall, while Piggott launched a full frontal assault on the redoubt. Major Pitcairn took 4 wounds and died leading the charge.
Yep. And he's actually buried in Boston, I think. Is it Old North Church? It's one of the churches. He's buried like in the basement, in the crypt.
Changed the result, and the British fell back in disarray. On the Colonial side, General Putnam continued to try to send reinforcements and resupply from Bunker to Breed's Hill, but his orders were continually ignored or misunderstood. Many Continental militiamen were deserting the battle, and there were now no more than 800 troops on the peninsula, with 150 in the redoubt. General Clinton now personally led reinforcements across the Charles River to help Howe. After evacuating the severely wounded and reforming the walking wounded, Clinton joined Howe, who resolved to concentrate the attack on the redoubt, this time using assault columns and bayonets only. At this point, the militia were almost out of ammunition and lacked bayonets. As the columns advanced, the redoubt's defenders expended their ammunition and began retreating. Colonel Prescott was among the last to retreat from the parapet.
And Prescott is the guy who very famously is said to have told his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." He was trying to instill some kind of fire discipline on militia who really haven't had much training in that way, to help them understand they needed to concentrate their fire at close range for maximum effect. But yeah, they're running out of ammo now. They're facing continual British assaults, but the casualty figures for the British in particular are going to be absolutely horrendous in this battle. The main loss for the Americans is going to be General Warren.
Urging the men to keep fighting while knocking away bayonet thrusts with his ceremonial sword. One of the last men killed was Dr. Warren via a single shot to the head. By 5 p.m., the surviving militia had retreated in good order across the neck to Cambridge.
And Warren's body is going to be horribly mutilated by the British troops afterward.
The British were stunned by the battle, and further offensive operations were called off. On his Pyrrhic triumph, Clinton wrote, "A dearly bought victory. Another such would have ruined us."
Yeah.
The British had won the battle, but at the cost of losing any chance to change the strategic situation. It was now painfully clear that they'd underestimated the Americans, and that this war would be much harder than anticipated. On the American side, morale was high after the battle.
Yeah.
Most of the units that were going to desert the army did before the end of the battle. Those that remained were even more determined to fight.
You just went toe-to-toe with British regulars, and while you had to give up the field, you inflicted horrible losses on them, and you showed that you can stand and fight. Now, this is very different than a battle of maneuver on a battlefield with divisions and brigades and things like that, but it did go a long way to giving a boost that was needed to the Americans.
Washington would arrive on July 2nd, finding willing but undisciplined companies. After reorganizing his command staff to replace Dr. Warren and other fallen leaders, he would embark on the arduous task of turning the militia companies into real soldiers.
Yep.
A harsh regime of teaching strict discipline, constant drill, and basic soldiering ensued.
And also just teaching them things like where to put the latrine at the camp and how to function on a daily basis. Now, Washington is not a brilliant military mind by any means, but he does at least have experience in this. And he is a great leader, and he knows how to delegate, and that goes a long way.
More pressingly, he needed heavy artillery, and tasked Henry Knox with retrieving the cannons captured at Ticonderoga. While Congress was encouraged by the news from Boston, more problems had arisen. Sir Guy Carleton, the governor of Quebec, was rebuilding abandoned border forts and was entreating with the Iroquois Confederacy to raid Upper New York. This required a response, and on June 27th, it authorized what would become an invasion of Quebec. In early July, Georgia finally signed onto the Continental Congress and sent a delegation. On July 5th, Congress adopted the Olive Branch Petition to King George III as a last chance to avoid war.
Yeah, it didn't go well.
On July 6th, the Congress issued the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. The two together made the case that the dispute was of loyal subjects of the Crown protecting themselves against a hostile parliament.
This is all a great point, because at this point, many of even the men in the Continental Congress are not thinking independence. They're thinking, let's fix this broken relationship. It's a lot like, I always make the comparison to Martin Luther during the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther didn't set out to break from the Catholic Church and start his own denomination, start Protestantism. He wanted to fix what he saw as broken. And at this point, that's the Continental Congress. This Olive Branch Petition is like the last gasp of loyal subjects of the king saying, we want to fix this, meet us halfway. We aren't trying to break away and form our own country. But when that is not responded to well, it pushes a lot of people off the fence.
It was unsuccessful. Gage's official report on Bunker Hill reached London on July 20th and caused an uproar. Lord North had Gage's recall issued on the 23rd, as both his and the king's positions hardened. King George resolved to crush this rebellion. The Olive Branch Petition was received on August 21st, but was ignored, and on the 23rd, King George issued the Proclamation of Rebellion. This war would be fought to the bitter end.
Right.
In our upcoming episodes on the War of American Revolution.
And George's response basically says to the effect that, hey, our loyal subjects in British America have been misled by these rebellious congressmen into revolt. And when they are willing to come back, they will be received with tenderness and mercy. And until then, they're going to be treated ruthlessly. And at that point, it was understood that there was no fixing this relationship, and it was going to lead to independence. So just in wrapping up, some figures from the Battle of Bunker Hill. Best estimate for the British side, you're looking at about 1,000 casualties out of the 3,000 or so who took part. You're looking at 19 officers killed, 62 officers wounded, 207 enlisted men killed, 766 wounded, about a little more than double the number of casualties on the American side. which lost about 400, 450, something like that. But important propaganda coup for the Americans to stand up to the British that way. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Definitely check out Kings and Generals. They've got an entire series on the whole Revolutionary War. I think it's like 4 hours in total, and it's all really good. What I've seen of it, I watched the first part just to get a feel for it, since I wasn't reacting to the first part, so I could do this second part. So thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.